My brother Lyle called me at 4:40 in the morning on a Tuesday to tell me to leave the city, and I almost hung up on him. We hadn't spoken in 5 months, not since the lawyer's office, not since I'd said the thing about the mill being a debt he'd dressed up as a duty. So when his number lit up my phone in the dark, my first thought wasn't fear. It was that he'd been drinking and wanted to finish the argument. "Craig," he said, "you need to listen to me, and you need to not talk for a minute." I sat up. Renata stirred beside me and put her hand flat on my back the way she does when she's asking without asking. "I'm Craig Boyle. I appraise commercial property for a living, and I've spent 22 years learning to hear the difference between a man who's bluffing and a man who's telling you something he's afraid of." Lyle was afraid. "One of my haul drivers, Petey, he ran feed up to the Effingham stops last night," Lyle said. "He called me around midnight from the truck stop out past the interchange. Said there was a man biting people in the lot. Not fighting, biting. Petey's not a dramatic guy, Craig. He drove off and he called me, and then about 20 minutes later, he called again from somewhere south, and I couldn't understand half of what he said. And then the call dropped, and he hasn't picked up since." "Okay," I said. "That's one guy." "It's not one guy." I heard him breathing, heard the tin echo of the scale house where he must have been standing. "Fuel guy was supposed to top off my diesel tank yesterday and never showed and never called. County's got I-70 shut somewhere and they won't say why. Just diverting all the commercial traffic south onto the 2 lanes. Bartell's wife works dispatch, and she told my other driver they've had more ambulance calls since midnight than they usually get in a week. And half of them, the crews don't come back on the radio. That's 4 different things, Craig. And none of them know about each other. And they all point the same direction. That's the part that reached me. Not the biting, the pattern. In my work, you learn that 1 bad number is a mistake, and 4 bad numbers pointing the same way is a fact you haven't understood yet. I've walked into buildings that looked fine on paper and known within 10 minutes they were rotten, because the little inconsistencies lined up. And lining up is the thing that liars and coincidences can't fake for long. If stories like this are your kind of thing, subscribe. And tell me this. If a brother you hadn't spoken to in 5 months called before dawn and told you to run, would you believe him? "Where are you telling me to go?" I said. "Here, the mill, before the roads fill up. If it's nothing, you get a bad breakfast and you get to yell at me in person." He paused. "If it's not nothing, Craig, you do not want to be in St. Louis when a couple million people figure this out at the same time." I looked at Renata. She'd sat up too, and she was watching my face, reading it the way I'd been reading Lyle's voice. We've been together 9 years. She's 44, teaches ceramics part-time at a community arts center off Manchester, keeps a level head in a way I've always envied and occasionally resented. I put the phone against my chest. "He thinks something's starting," I said. "He wants us to drive down to the mill." "Do you believe him?" I thought about the fuel supplier not calling. A fuel supplier not calling is a small, ugly detail, the kind nobody would invent. "I believe he believes it," I said. "And I believe the diesel thing." She was already up, pulling clothes from the chair. "That's Renata. She doesn't need to win the argument before she starts moving." "Then we go and we feel stupid, or we go and we're glad," she said. "Both of those are better than the third one." I put the phone back to my ear. "We'll leave inside the hour." "Craig." Lyle's voice caught. "When you get here, you call me from the road first. Don't just roll up on the yard. I need to know it's you at the gate before I come down to it." I didn't understand that yet. I told him fine, and I hung up. And I stood in the dark of a bedroom I'd owned for 11 years and felt the specific vertigo of a man who is about to find out whether his brother is a fool or a prophet, and who suspects, uncomfortably, that his brother has never once been a fool. We pack the way you pack when you don't yet believe you need to. Renata took the good knives from the kitchen, which struck me as strange until it didn't. I took cash from the drawer, my laptop out of habit. 3 days of clothes because that felt like the outer edge of reasonable. I filled the water bottles. She filled the tub. In case, she said, and even then, part of me thought this was theater, that in 6 hours we'd be pouring it out and laughing. We took her Outback because it had 3/4 of a tank and my truck had less. Southern Illinois from our part of St. Louis is a straight shot down and across, cross the river and pick up the interstate east and then drop south on the state routes toward the little towns that don't make it onto weather maps. Our father's mill sits outside a place called Kesterson in Ardell County, on a county road that used to be busy when the elevator took in half the grain in the township and is quiet now that the big co-op consolidated everything 20 miles east. Lyle kept it running anyway. Custom feed grinding, some storage, a scale that the local farmers still trusted. It never made real money. That was the whole argument distilled. I looked at it and saw a property, and Lyle looked at it and saw our father. We got to the bridge a little before 6, and the sky over the water was the flat gray that isn't dawn yet. And the traffic going east was already wrong. Not heavy, wrong. Cars moving too fast in the dark, a pickup on the shoulder with its doors open and nobody near it, and once, on the far side, a police cruiser sitting sideways across 2 lanes with its lights going and no officer in sight. Renata slowed, and I said, "Don't. Keep going," and she kept going. "That's an accident scene with no cops," she said quietly. "Or a checkpoint they abandoned. Which is worse?" I didn't answer. I was watching the radio, which I'd left on a St. Louis news station, and the man was reading traffic in the too smooth voice of somebody working off a script that no longer matched the world. Delays on 70. Avoid the Metro East. Emergency crews responding to multiple incidents. And then once, unscripted, a small pause, and the man said, "We're getting a lot of calls this morning, folks. And I want to just say, stay home if you can." And then caught himself and went back to the traffic. That little slip did more to scare me than any siren. A professional reaching past his copy to warn people is a professional who's read something off air that he isn't allowed to say. We made good time until we didn't. 40 minutes east of the river, the interstate stacked up, brake lights all the way to a haze at the horizon. And I told Renata to take the next exit before we got trapped in it. This is the part where my job actually mattered, the first of several times it would. I've spent 2 decades looking at maps of parcels and access easements and the ugly service roads behind commercial properties, and I have a fair sense of how the American landscape is wired underneath the main lines. I knew that these interstate exits in farm country dump you onto county roads that run parallel, section by section. In a grid you can navigate if you keep your directions straight. So we came off the ramp into a little dead town, and I put us south and east on a gravel road between 2 fields. And for a while, it was almost peaceful, just us. And the dust and the corn stubble. And I let myself think the worst of it was behind us. That was the wrong thing to think. The road we needed to cross was a state highway. 2 lanes, the kind with a gas station and a grain co-op, and not much else at the intersection. And there'd been a wreck. A minivan and a stock trailer, jackknifed, and the trailer had come apart. And there were people out of their cars, and at first it read as an ordinary bad morning, the universal choreography of a highway accident, people standing in that stunned huddle. Renata slowed. I told her to go around on the shoulder. But there was a woman on the ground by the minivan, and a man crouched over her. And the man looked up at us, and his face was the face of somebody who has run out of options. And Renata stopped the car. She stopped it before I could finish saying, "Don't." 2 seconds, she said, and she was out. I want to be careful here, because I've told this part of it to myself 100 ways since, some of them kinder to me than the truth. Renata went to the woman on the ground, because that is who Renata is. And it is the thing I loved most about her, and the thing that, in the space of 10 minutes, killed her. The woman had gone through the windshield or into the dash. There was blood on her face, and her arm was wrong. And Renata knelt in the glass and the coolant, and took off her own flannel shirt to press against the arm. I got out too. I'm not proud that I stood by the car for the first few seconds doing arithmetic about time, but I did. And then I went to her, because I always went where she went. And that is a fact about me I would try very hard to forget later. Then the noise started. Down the highway, from the direction of the co-op, 3 or 4 figures were coming. And they weren't coming like people come to help. They came in that lurching hurry I would come to know too well. And one of them was making a sound that wasn't language. The man crouched by the minivan, saw them, and stood up and just left. Ran to his truck and left. And I understood in one cold drop that whatever Lyle had been trying to tell me was here, now, on this road. Renata, Renata, we go. Now. She looked up. The woman under her hands was making a low sound. Renata's forearm had a red line across it, bright, welling. And I didn't know then, and I don't know now, whether that came from the broken windshield glass she was kneeling in or from the woman's teeth, when the woman, who I had thought was only hurt, turned her head and caught Renata's arm in a movement too fast to follow. It happened in the blur of me pulling my partner up and away. Renata swore and yanked her arm back, and there was blood, hers and the woman's mixed. And then we were both running, and the lurching figures were close enough that I could see their faces. And I got Renata into the car, and I drove us up onto the shoulder and around the wreck and away with the tires spitting gravel. For a mile, neither of us said anything. Renata had her flannel wrapped around her own forearm now, pressing it, and her hands were shaking, which I'd never seen. It was glass, she said. I knelt in glass. There was glass everywhere. Okay. She grabbed my arm, but that's... people grab you. That's just... Okay, I said again, because I couldn't say anything else. Because I'd seen it. And I couldn't have told you either. And because a small, terrible clerk in the back of my head had already opened a file and written uncertain at the top, and I hated him for it. We didn't turn the radio back on. There was nothing on it we wanted to know. The sun was up, thin and yellow, by the time we came down the last county road toward Kesterson. And I saw the elevator tower standing over the flat land the way it had stood over my whole childhood. Gray concrete silos in a row, and the tall head house on top, and the leg between them, and the sheet metal buildings hunched around the base, and the chain-link fence my father had put up in the 80s after somebody stole a load of soybeans. The fence that was built to keep out thieves, not the dead. Lyle's operation, our father's before that. The thing I'd tried to turn into a check. I called him from a half-mile out the way he'd told me to. He said he'd meet us at the main gate. And when we came up the last stretch of County Road and the yard opened out on our left, I saw that the main gate on the yard side was already closed. And it was chained. I pulled up short of it and put the car in park and got out, and I could see Lyle on the other side of the wire, standing back from the fence maybe 20 feet, in his canvas coat. and he had a shotgun broken open over his forearm, not pointed at anything, just there, the way a farmer carries a gun when he's decided he might need it. Behind him, the yard looked the way it always looked, the scale house, the shop, a couple of grain trucks parked nose in, the diesel tank on its stand. Home base, sanctuary, 20 feet away behind a chain. "Lyle," I said, "open the gate. We made it. It's happening. You were right. Open the gate." He didn't move toward it. He looked at me, and then he looked past me at the car, at Renata in the passenger seat. And I saw his eyes go to her arm, to the flannel wrapped around it, dark now where it had soaked through. "What happened to her?" he said. "Not to Renata, to me, flat. There was a wreck. She stopped to help somebody. It's a cut, Lyle. She cut herself on the glass." "Was there anyone infected at that wreck?" The words sat in the cold air between us. Infected. He said it like he already had a whole framework built around it, and of course he did. He'd had 2 more hours than me to build it, and he'd spent them at the gate deciding what he was going to do. "I don't know," I said. And even as I said it, I understood that I had just answered his real question. You don't know. There were people coming down the road. She was helping a woman who was hurt. The woman... I stopped. I made myself say it because lying to Lyle about this seemed, in that moment, like the one thing I couldn't do. The woman grabbed her arm. Renata says it was the glass. It might have been the glass. Lyle closed the shotgun. Not to threaten, just a man's hands doing something while his head worked. He came a few steps closer to the fence, close enough that I could see he hadn't slept, that his face had aged since the lawyer's office. And he looked at Renata again. And Renata rolled the window down and said, "Lyle, hi, I'm sorry. This is a hell of a way to see you." "Hi, Renata," he said. And his voice was gentle with her in a way it had not been with me. "How's the arm?" "It hurts. It's not deep. I really think it's glass." "I believe you might be right," Lyle said. "And I can't act like you are." I knew then. I knew before he said it. I've made my living reading the moment a negotiation turns, the exact beat where the other party has already decided, and everything after is just them explaining it to you. And this was that beat. "Lyle," I said. He turned to me, and I saw the whole shape of it in his face. "I've got people in here," he said. "The Hoyts from down the road. They came at 5 with their 3 kids. Petey's wife and his boy, because Petey's not coming home. That's 8 people already. And if I let you 2 in, it's 10. And every one of them is depending on the idea that nothing comes through this gate that we haven't checked. You understand what I'm telling you? If I let her in and she was exposed, and it goes the way that man on the truck stop went, I don't lose one person. I lose all of them. In here, at night, in buildings we can't all get out of. I've got kids sleeping in the scale house, Craig." "She wasn't bitten," I said. "She was cut. You just told me you don't know." "Lyle." "I'll let you in," he said. "You, right now. This gate opens for you, and it opens this second, and I've got a bed for you inside. But I can't put her in the yard with those kids until we know. That's the truth of it, and I'm not going to dress it up." "So what?" I said. My voice had gone somewhere hard. "She sleeps in the field? In the car? What is she, Lyle? Cargo you can't sign for?" He flinched at that, and I was glad, and I'm ashamed now that I was glad. "There's a maintenance trailer," he said, "out past the fence line, by the old rail siding on the service strip. Outside the yard, but I can see it from the catwalk, and I can get to it. It's got a bunk and a heater, and I'll run a cord out under the fence for power. Water and food I'll carry out to you both. You stay out there with her if you want. I'd expect you to. I'd think less of you if you didn't. 2 weeks. If she's clean in 2 weeks, she comes through this gate, and I'll be the first to apologize to her face and mean it. But not tonight, and not inside this fence. That's the deal. That's the only deal I've got. I stood there with my hands on the chain link, and I looked at my brother through the diamonds of the fence, at the yard I could not enter. And I hated him with a purity I'd never managed, even at our worst. And underneath the hate, way down where I didn't want to look, a part of me that had spent 22 years assessing risk knew that everything he'd said was correct. That if our positions were reversed, if it were his partner with blood on her arm and my 3 borrowed children sleeping in the scale house, I might have chained the same gate. That was the worst part. Not that he was cruel, that he wasn't. "Craig," Renata said from the car. "It's okay, let's do the trailer. He's right." She said it to make it easier for me. She was the one being kept out, and she was managing my feelings about it. That's who she was. Lyle didn't open the gate. He didn't come outside it either. He got in his pickup on his side of the fence and drove down to the far corner of the yard, to the second gate by the siding that led onto the service strip. And he opened that one only long enough to nose his truck through and then chained it behind him. And he led us the long way around the outside of the fence on the rough service track, past the base of the silos where the concrete rose up into the morning light, out to the far corner where an old single-wide sat on blocks beside the disused rail siding, weeds grown up around the wheels, outside the wire, inside of it, home of a kind, a quarantine of a kind, a version of survival that I told myself, that first day, I could live with. I want to describe the mill a little, because it becomes the whole world of this story, and you should be able to see it. Picture a fenced yard, maybe the size of 2 city blocks. Along one side, the row of concrete silos, 6 of them, joined at the top by the head house and the leg, that vertical structure that carries grain up on a belt of buckets. At the base, the pits where trucks dump, covered with heavy steel grates. Then the sheet metal buildings, the grinding shop with its augers and its hammer mill, the storage sheds, the little scale house by the truck scale near the main gate, the diesel tank on its steel stand feeding the trucks and the backup generator. A well with a pump that gave decent water but not unlimited water. Catwalks running up the outside of the silos and across the top, from which a man could see the whole county, the county road, and the trailer on its strip outside the wire. Big work lights on poles that Lyle used to run all night in harvest season, and that now he kept dark because light, he'd already figured out, was a thing you did not want to advertise. And everywhere, in the buildings and the trucks and the pits, grain, corn mostly, some soybeans, some milled feed, tons of it. Enough calories to feed a small army, and not one green vegetable in the whole complex, not one thing with vitamin C, a fact that would come to matter more than any of us understood that first week. The trailer sat outside the primary fence, which is the thing I need you to hold in your mind, because everything turns on it. To get to us, Lyle had to come out through the siding gate, cross the strip, and come back. To get to them, we'd have to do the same in reverse, and the siding gate was chained, and the main gate was chained. And between Renata and those children, there was a fence and 2 locks, and my brother's judgment. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Lyle ran the cord out under the fence to the trailer like he'd promised. He brought a case of water and a box of food, canned stuff, crackers, a jar of the pickles the Hoyts had brought, which felt like a small mercy in a place with no fresh anything. He set it on the trailer step, and he looked at Renata's arm again. And he'd brought a first aid kit, too. And he handed it over without a word about who should use it. Then he stood back the required distance, and he said, "I come out twice a day, morning and evening. And when I come, I need to see her. Both of you, at the trailer, in the daylight, where I can look at her face and her arm. That's the check. You flag me from the window in between if you need something. You don't come to the fence, and you don't touch the fence. And every time I come, she's standing in that doorway where I can see her, or I have to assume the worst. You understand me, Craig. I see her, or I act like she's already turned. Understood, Renata said before I could. Say it back to me. Twice a day at the trailer in the light, she said. You see my face, I'll be there. Craig, Lyle said, walk with me. I followed him a few paces down the strip toward his truck, out of Renata's hearing. I'm not doing this to be right about you, he said, low. I know what you think of me, that I turned Dad's junk into a religion. Maybe I did. But I've had all night to watch the roads on the scanner, and I'm telling you, this thing eats groups. It doesn't eat individuals, it eats groups. Because groups are where one person carrying it becomes 10. I need that fence to stay a line where that can't happen. If that costs me my brother's good opinion for 2 weeks, I'll pay it. And if it costs you Renata? He looked at me for a long moment. I hope to God it doesn't, he said. I mean that, but I've got 8 people behind that wire and 3 of them are kids, and I can't spend their lives on my hope. He got in his truck and drove back around to the siding gate and let himself in and chained it. And I stood in the weeds outside the fence with the smell of dust and diesel and old grain, which is the smell of my entire childhood. And I watched him go, and I made a decision. Not that day. I want to be honest about the timeline. That day, I was decent. But standing there, I felt the first seed of it. The thought that would grow into the worst thing I ever did. He is treating a decision about the woman I love as a math problem. And I will not let math be the last word. The first days on the strip were almost gentle, which is its own cruelty when you look back. Renata's arm scabbed over clean. No fever, no chills. She ate, she slept. She made fun of my snoring. She drew in the little notebook she'd grabbed, mostly the silos, the way the light came off the concrete at different hours. We watched the mill wake up each morning from our exile at the edge of it, on the wrong side of the wire, the Hoyt kids running along the inside of the fence, the thin thread of smoke when Lyle let them cook once a day. Twice a day, Lyle came out through the siding gate and stood his distance, and Renata stood in the trailer doorway in the daylight and let him look at her, her face, her arm, the color of her. And he took his readings of us like a man checking a gauge. By the 4th day, he'd unbent enough to bring Renata a real book, and she thanked him. And they talked for a minute across the gap about nothing. And I could see him wanting to believe he'd been wrong, wanting it badly. But the world got worse while our little corner stayed still. On the scanner Lyle monitored and reported to me in clipped visits. The county came apart in stages. The state routes filled and then emptied. There was shooting one night out toward the highway. We could hear it. Lasani distant pops that weren't hunting. Twice we saw infected on the county road beyond the strip, 1s and 2s, drawn by God knows what, moving along the ditch and then wandering off. And that was the thing that began to work on me, because the trailer sat outside the wire, closer to that road than anything else on the property. And if one of those shapes turned off the road toward us, there was no fence between it and the bunk where Renata slept. The mill had a wall. We had a door and a hope. I started bringing this up to Lyle. Reasonably at first. Look, the trailer's outside the fence entirely. It's the most exposed point for a mile. If she's clean at a week, couldn't she at least move to a vehicle inside the wire, up near the shop, where the group could respond? Lyle said a week wasn't 2 weeks. I said the danger out here was greater than the danger in there. Lyle said the danger out here was to 2 people, and the danger in there was to 8. And he was sorry, and the answer was no. And I want you to notice what I was doing, because I didn't notice it at the time. I was building a case. That's my whole professional life. Building the case, arranging the true facts, so the conclusion I already want falls out of them, looking inevitable. The trailer was exposed. That was true. Renata had no symptoms at 9 days. That was true. The infected on the road were getting closer. That was true, or true enough. And from those 3 true things, I was constructing the permission to do what I'd already decided to do. And I was constructing it so well that when I finally did it, it felt less like a choice than like a conclusion. In those same days, I was learning the property the way I'd never let myself learn it before. Because now, it wasn't a thing to sell. It was a thing to get into. I walked the outside of the fence on the pretext of stretching my legs, and I read it the way I read buildings. The main gate and the whole yard fence were theft fencing. 4-foot chain link with a top rail. Fine against a man with a truck, and no good against a body that felt no pain and just kept pushing. The siding gate by us was chained through a hasp mounted to a post that had been rotting since before our father died. I'd swung that gate 1,000 times as a boy. I knew it in my hands. It would not hold a determined push, and it opened onto ground that, if you cut across behind the far silos, brought you up to the back of the shop by a route nobody watched, because nobody thought of it as a route at all. Nobody but a man who reads properties for a living, and who grew up on this one. And I learned the electrical, because I always read the panels. Lyle told me the rest in his clipped visits, proud despite himself of how he'd rigged the place to run dark. The diesel generator by the shop could carry the well pump and a handful of isolated circuits, but not the whole yard at once. Run too many loads, and it bogged and stalled. And diesel was finite with the fuel man dead on some road somewhere. So Lyle kept it off except a few hours at midday for the well. The big work lights were split across circuits at a panel in the shop, this pole and that pole on their own breakers. And I read the labels and the faded marker. And I walked it until I knew which breaker lit the yard, and which lit the scale, and which lit the far corner by the siding, out here, by us. And the hammer mill, the grinder, was its own heavy circuit, its own breaker, the loudest single thing on the property, which was why Lyle ran it maybe an hour a week, and only in daylight, and only when he had no choice, because it drank diesel, and it could be heard for miles. I filed all of it. I told myself I was filing it because knowing your surroundings is what keeps you alive. That was true too. Everything I told myself was true. That was the whole problem. Here is the piece that made it possible. The siding gate would not hold, and the route behind the silos was mine. And on the 11th night, it stormed. Not badly, but enough that the wind covered sound and the rain covered movement. And enough that a pack of infected, 4 or 5, came off the county road and fetched up against the trailer end of the strip, not 30 yards from us, outside everything, drawn by I never knew what, and stayed there in the dark. And there was no fence between them and us, only distance and rain. And Renata sat up in the bunk with her arms around her knees and did not make a sound, and neither did I. And we watched the dark shapes drift and stall by the lightning. And I did the arithmetic I'd been building toward for 11 days. Out here, on the wrong side of the wire, we were dead if they came. In there, behind the buildings, up near the group, we had a chance. Renata was 11 days clean. 11 days. That's a long time. That's long enough that a reasonable man could say the risk had mostly passed. I told myself it was almost 2 weeks. I told myself Lyle's 2-week rule was arbitrary, a round number, not a medical fact. Because he'd admitted himself he didn't know the incubation. Nobody did. I told myself I wasn't overriding a truth, only a guess. And my guess was as good as his. Better. Because I was the one out here with no fence and the dead in the weeds 30 yards off. Every single one of those thoughts was true. And the sum of them was a lie. And I knew it. And I did it anyway. I waited until the storm's worst hour, near 3 in the morning, when even the shapes on the strip had drifted off down the road after some noise I couldn't hear. I took Renata's hand. "We're not staying out here," I said. "Get your shoes." Craig. She knew immediately. She always knew me faster than I wanted. He said 2 weeks, and it's been 11 days, and there's no fence between us and them. And I'm not going to sit in a tin can outside the wire and wait to find out if he's got the number right. I heard my own voice. Calm, reasoned. The voice I use with clients when the number's already decided. "You're clean, Ren. You've been clean since the first day. This isn't the exposure I'm afraid of. It's that." I pointed out at the dark strip, at the place where the shapes had been. She was quiet a long moment. The rain hit the metal roof. "If we go in and he's right and I'm not clean," she said, "then I did that. To those kids, not you. Me. You're clean. You don't know that. You told him you didn't know that. I heard you. And this is the thing I have to live with. And I'll say it plainly because I've stopped being able to soften it. She was more honest than I was. Standing in that trailer, she was the one holding the real question in her hands. And I took it from her. I told her I knew. I told her I was sure. I said the words a good negotiator says when he needs the other party to move, and she trusted me, because trusting me was a habit 9 years deep. And she put on her shoes. We went out into the rain and along the strip to the siding gate, and I put my shoulder to the post. And it gave the way I'd known it would, the rotten wood tearing loose from the concrete footing. And I got the chain slack enough to swing the gate, and we slipped through. Inside the wire now, inside the line my brother had drawn his whole survival around, and cut behind the far silos on the route only I knew. Staying low, the rain running off us. And I felt, God help me, competent. I felt like the smartest man on the property. I got us up to the back of the shop and through the man door that Lyle never locked because it was deep inside the fence, and who would come at it from that side. And I brought Renata into the dry dark of the shop, among the augers and the smell of ground corn, and I settled her behind the workbench with a tarp. And I sat with her. And around 4, the rain slacked and the storm moved off, and nothing happened. Nothing at all. For 3 days, nothing happened. And holding that up was harder than I'd told myself it would be, because Lyle still came twice a day, and Lyle still wanted to see her. That was the part I hadn't let myself think all the way through in the trailer. The check, twice a day, in the light, at the trailer, her face. So I ran a shell of it. Renata stayed in the shop and through the dark hours, when the danger and the cold were worst and my whole excuse lived. And before each scheduled check, I brought her back out the way we'd come, behind the silos and through the siding gate I'd left rigged to look chained, out to the trailer. And I stood her in the doorway in the daylight, and Lyle came out through the yard gate and looked at her across the strip, and saw her face and her arm and the color of her. And he went away satisfied. Morning check, back to the shop. Evening check, out to the trailer. It was exhausting, and it was insane, and every crossing was a risk. And I told myself, each time it was the last time, that tonight I'd tell him. Renata hated all of it. She'd stopped arguing and gone somewhere quiet and far, and once, behind the bench, she said, "This isn't safe for them, Craig. It's only safe for us. You've just made the fence into a thing that lies for you." I told her she was clean. She looked at me like she was trying to memorize my face before it changed into something she wouldn't know. On the third morning, she didn't want to make the crossing for the check. She had a headache. I told her it was the dust in the shop, the ground corn. It gets into everything. It gives everyone headaches. That was even true. I got her out to the trailer for the morning check anyway and stood her in the doorway, and Lyle looked at her a beat longer than usual, I thought, and asked if she was all right. And she said tired, just tired, and he nodded and went. By that afternoon, back in the shop, she was warm. By evening, she was shivering and warm at the same time, and there was a sheen on her that no dust makes. And there was no walking her out to any doorway for any check. And when Lyle came at evening, I met him at the trailer alone and told him she was asleep, finally sleeping hard. And could he let her be? And he stood on the strip a long moment, looking at the dark trailer windows. And something in his face was already moving, already counting. And he said, "Craig, I need to see her tomorrow morning. In the light. I mean it." And he went. And I knew I had bought one night and not an hour more. She got worse fast, faster than I'd braced for. By the middle of that night, she didn't know where she was. And she was strong in a way she'd never been. And I had backed against the augers with my hands up. And I was saying her name. And it did no good. Her name did no good. Whatever was looking out of her face when it turned toward me in the dark was not answering to it. And I made noise. God forgive me. I panicked. And I knocked a wrench off the bench, and it rang off the concrete like a bell. And I shouted her name once, out loud, before I could stop myself. And in a compound full of sleeping people who'd built their whole survival on silence, that sound went everywhere. The door came open, and a light hit me. Lyle's light, and behind him, young Cody Hoyt, 17, the oldest, who'd come running the way 17-year-olds do, toward the trouble without being told. Lyle saw me against the augers. He saw the shape moving in the dark of the shop that had been Renata. And I watched my brother's face in the backwash of his own flashlight do the thing I will see every night for the rest of my life, which is understand, all at once, exactly what I had done and exactly what it was going to cost. And there was no time to say any of it, because the thing that had been the woman I loved crossed the shop faster than any of us could have believed. And Cody, 17, standing too close to me, in a doorway he'd run to because he was brave, was the one who was there. Lyle fired once, and the shot in that steel building was a physical blow. And it wasn't in time. It stopped Renata. It did not stop what had already happened to Cody in the second before. The bite high on his shoulder near the neck. Deep. The kind you don't argue about afterward. He went down against the doorframe with his hand up to it, and this look of pure confusion, a boy trying to understand a fact that his body had received before his mind could. Renata dropped where the shot took her and did not move again, and I did not look at her. I have never once looked at that memory straight on. I looked at Cody, and Lyle was already on his knees beside the boy, pressing his own hand over the wound, as if pressure could take it back. Nobody screamed. That's the thing I remember about the group in those first minutes, the discipline of it, the way Lyle had trained them without any of us realizing he'd been training them. Beth Hoyt came to the door and saw her son on the floor and made one sound, low, into her fist. and then she was down beside him too. And the younger kids were kept back by Petey's wife, Sandra, who put her body in the doorway like a wall. And Lyle looked up at me from beside the dying boy, and he didn't shout. That was worse than shouting. "How long?" he said. "Lyle, how long has she been inside this fence, Craig?" I couldn't say 3 days. I said, "Since the storm," and he did the arithmetic. Everyone in that doorway did the arithmetic, and I watched them understand that the checks they'd trusted had been a shell, that the man who'd shown up begging at their gate had been walking an infected woman in and out of the shadow of the silos for 3 days while their children slept. Cody was clear-headed for a little while. That's the mercy and the horror of it, that it isn't instant, that he had time to be afraid and to know. He asked his mother if he was going to turn, and she said, "No, baby. No." And she was lying the way I'd been lying. And everyone in the room knew it was a lie, including Cody, who was 17 and not a child anymore. Lyle sent everyone else out. He stayed. I stayed because I could not make my legs carry me anywhere. And when it was clear, when the fever came up in the boy, the way it had come up in Renata, Lyle took him out to the truck scale, away from the buildings, and he did the thing that had to be done himself, with his own hand, so that Beth wouldn't have to, and so that I wouldn't be trusted with it. And he came back with his coat wrong and his face gray, and he walked past me like I was a post. They buried Cody the next day in the strip of ground behind the shop, and Renata some distance off, because Beth could not bear them close, and I did not have standing to object to anything. I dug both graves. It was the only thing anyone would let me do. Nobody spoke to me that day, except Sandra, who told me flatly where the shovel was. And Lyle, who at the end of it stood at the edge of the 2 mounds and said, without looking at me, "You'll go back to the trailer, outside the wire, where you started. You'll stay to it unless I send for you. You'll do work I give you, and you won't be near the children." He paused. "I'm not driving you off down the road, because you're my brother and because Dad would climb out of the ground. But you understand there's nothing left between us but the fence." "Lyle," I said, "I thought she was clean. 11 days. I did the—" "I know exactly what you did," he said. "You did what you always do. You found a way to make the thing you wanted sound like the thing that was right. You did it about the mill, and you did it about her, and it cost me Beth's boy." He looked at me then, finally, and there was no hate in it, which I could have borne. There was just a tiredness that went all the way down. "The worst part is you probably still think 11 days was a reasonable read." "It wasn't reasonable, Craig. It was you wanting. There's a difference, and it's the only difference that matters now." He walked back to the buildings, and I went out through the siding gate to the trailer, back outside the wire where I'd begun. And that was the end of the first part of what happened at the mill, and the beginning of the man I became. I won't pretend I broke down and repented. That's the story people expect, and it isn't what happened. What happened is that something in me went quiet and hard. I've turned it over looking for the moment I chose to become what I became. Ta-ta, and I don't think there was a moment. I think grief and shame, if you won't let them out through the front, come out the back as certainty. I could not carry what I'd done as guilt. It was too heavy. So I set it down and picked up a rule instead. And the rule was small enough to carry. Uncertainty kills. I gambled on maybe, and a boy is dead. I will never gamble on maybe again. You can see how clean that is. You can see how it takes the thing I'm ashamed of and turns it into wisdom. That's the trick I've done my whole life. This time, the material was Cody Hoyt and my own dead partner. And I did the trick on that too, and it worked. And I have never entirely stopped being disgusted that it worked. So I became useful. That was my penance and my armor both. I knew buildings, and this was a place made of buildings. And Lyle let me back inside the wire to work because the property needed what I knew. And pride is a thing you spend when your children are behind the fence. I went up the silos and the leg and the head house with a notebook. And I did what I do. I assessed the property honestly for the first time in my life. Not as a thing to sell, but as a thing to survive in. And I found its lies. The theft fencing that wouldn't stop a body that felt no pain. The siding gate I'd already exploited, which I rebuilt with my own hands out of shame. New post set in concrete. And 3 other rotted posts along the line, which I marked, and which Lyle, without a word passing between us about how I'd learned to spot such things, had the boys set new. The pits under the silos, covered with grates a man could lift. I had them chained down, because a covered pit full of grain is a drowning trap, and an uncovered one is a grave. And the electrical I already knew. But now I mapped it clean and labeled every circuit at the shop panel in fresh marker. Yard, scale, far corner, well, grinder. Which ones the generator could carry together and which would bog it, because I'd begun thinking about light and power the way Lyle thought about them, as a thing you spent, a thing you could point. And I started saying no. That was the change in me that mattered, and Lyle saw it before I did. The first time was a man on the county road, alone, waving, calling out that he had water to trade. 2 months earlier, I'd have been the one arguing to bring him close enough to talk. The one who'd have said an uncertain stranger deserved the benefit of the doubt. Now I stood at the fence, and I looked at him, and I looked at the road behind him, and I said, through the wire, keep moving. There's a church in Kesterson taking people. I didn't know if there was. I said it to move him off, and he went. And I felt nothing, and that nothing frightened Sandra, who was standing near more than any shouting would have. Lyle came to me that evening. It was the first time he'd sought me out since the graves. You turned a man off at the fence today, he said. He was a risk we didn't need. You didn't check him. You didn't ask what he had. You just closed it. I looked at my brother, and here's the reversal that this whole thing turns on, and I'll let it stand without dressing it up. Lyle, who had chained the gate against Renata, who had built this place on nothing comes through that we haven't checked, was standing in front of me troubled that I'd sent a man away without checking. Because Lyle had been counting. He'd been counting fuel and calories and the color of the Hoyt kids' gums. And he'd done the same arithmetic on the mill that I'd done on Renata. And it came out the same ugly way it always does. The mill could not feed 8 people through a winter on corn and canned pickles. We needed things we didn't have and could not grow. Green things, salt, medicine. And the only place any of that was coming from now was the road. From other people, from trade. From exactly the openness he'd have died to prevent in the first week. We can't stay closed forever, Craig, he said. I know how that sounds, coming from me. I've done the numbers. We've got maybe 11 weeks of decent eating, and then it's cornmeal and whatever we can barter for. And you can't barter behind a locked fence. Somewhere in the next month, I'm going to have to let people close enough to deal with. And I need you to be able to do that without slamming it shut on reflex. Reflex, I said. You mean caution. You taught me the caution, Lyle. I taught you to check, he said, not to refuse. There's a difference. He almost smiled, and it was the saddest thing. God help me, I'm standing here arguing your old side of it. 2 months ago, you'd have loved this. I didn't love it. Something in me had gone the other way and couldn't come back. And I knew, even then, that the brothers had traded places and that neither trade was clean. That his softening came from responsibility for 8 mouths and mine from the 2 graves behind the shop. And that we were both in our new positions, partly right and partly ruined. The traders came in the 9th week. They came in the afternoon, which people who mean well tend to do. And they came in 3 vehicles, a box truck and 2 pickups. And they stopped well back from the gate the way you do when you want to look reasonable. And a woman got out, with her hands visible, and called up that they were trading, that they had garden goods and salt and some medicine, that they'd heard down the road there was a mill still running. There were 7 of them that I could see, maybe 8, well-fed, unhurried. Their vehicles were clean and full, and they moved like people who'd solved the problem of eating some time ago. And that, before anything else, was what put a splinter into me. Everyone else on the roads that fall moved like the hunted. These people moved like they'd been doing the hunting. Lyle wanted to trade. I could see the want in him, in the whole compound, because they had onions, actual onions, and a sack of oranges. And Beth's youngest, Tessa, 6 years old, had been listless for weeks, in a way a mother knows, and a man with a notebook only suspects. And everyone looked at those oranges and saw the color coming back into a child's face. I looked at the trucks. This is the part where my work was the whole difference, and I want to be careful not to make myself sound clever, because clever is what got Cody killed. I wasn't clever. I was suspicious, which is a different and uglier thing, and I'd become good at it. I walked the fence line while the woman talked, and I looked at their box truck the way I've looked at 10,000 pieces of commercial property, at what it was telling me about itself against what its owner was telling me. The box truck had a company name ghosted on the door under a coat of flat gray paint, the way an owner-operator never paints over their own name, but the way a thief always does. The pickups had ranch supply toolboxes in the beds with the county co-op's inventory stencils half scratched off. There was a generator strapped in the box truck's open back with a municipal asset tag on it. The little metal plate that a city bolts to equipment. A thing no private trader in the world would be hauling around unless they'd taken it from a place that no longer needed it. And their story was that they'd come up from a farm collective near Carbondale. But the mud on their tires was the pale gray of the gravel roads north of us, not the red clay you get down that way. And the box truck rode low and even on its springs, loaded heavy and loaded balanced, which is not how a truck rides when it's carrying loose garden trade. It rides like that when it's carrying fuel drums or ammunition, or the accumulated take of a group that goes to places and comes back full. None of it was proof. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to everything that came after. Every single thing I saw had an innocent explanation, if you wanted one. Scratched off stencils, secondhand equipment, mixed mud. I'd spent my whole career learning that any one inconsistency is nothing, and 4 inconsistencies pointing the same direction is a fact. I'd learned it at 4:40 in the morning on a Tuesday from my brother, actually, though neither of us said so. I told Lyle, quietly, at the scale house. I laid it out. The painted-over name, the asset tag, the co-op stencils, the wrong mud, the way the truck sat. Lyle listened. He didn't dismiss it. That was the difference between us now, that I'd stopped listening and he hadn't. So they're scavengers, he said. Everybody's a scavenger. Doesn't mean they took it off living people. The generator's got a city tag, I said. The onions came out of somebody's garden. Somebody who planted it in the spring, back when planting a garden made sense. You don't get a mature garden's worth of onions in the fall of the first year unless you take it from whoever grew it. That reached him. I watched it reach him, and I watched him do the thing that responsibility does to a person, which is weigh the ugly possibility against the listless child, and come down, tentatively, on the side of the child. "We trade small," he said. "Onions and the fruit and a little of the medicine for a couple 100 pounds of corn. We do it at the gate. They don't come in, we don't go out." One time, and we watched them the whole while. He looked at me. "I hear you. But I've got a kid whose gums are bleeding and I'm not going to let her get sick because we're afraid of a paint job." We traded. It went smoothly, which is how these things go the first time. That's the whole method. They were pleasant. The woman, who said her name was June, was warm and easy and asked good questions about the mill. Too many good questions, careful ones, about how many of us there were and whether the well ran year-round and how much diesel a place like this went through. Appraisal questions. I recognized them because they were my own questions, the ones I'd ask if I were valuing a property before I decided what to do with it. I said little and I answered less. And I saw her clock me as the difficult one, the one who'd notice things, and I saw her file that away. And while she talked, I watched her eyes go once, twice, past the main gate to the far corner of the fence, to the siding, to the strip and the trailer beyond it, measuring the line the way I'd measured it my third day. And I knew she was reading the back of the property the same way I would. They left with our corn, and we ate onions that night. And Tessa brightened over the next few days the way Lyle had gambled she would. And for a little while, it looked as though he'd been right, and my suspicion had been the paranoia of a man who'd been badly burned. That's the thing about my kind of hardness. It's correct often enough to feel like wisdom, and wrong often enough to ruin people. And there's no way to tell which from the inside. They came back 11 days later. I remember it was 11 days, because 11 days is a number that lives in me now. And I noticed it, and I took no comfort from it. They didn't come to trade. They came at night, which was the whole answer to the question of who they were. And they came smart, which was the whole answer to how dangerous. I'd like to tell you I predicted the exact shape of it. I didn't. I'd predicted the fact of it, which is different. What I hadn't predicted, what nobody could have, was the way the infected had thickened on the county road that fall, drawn over the weeks by the mill itself, by the well pump at midday and the small smoke and the accumulated evidence that living things were here. There were a lot of them in the ditches and the fields around us now, dozens drifting, and June's people knew it, and they used it. The first thing was light and noise at the main gate. 2 of their vehicles at the front, headlights on. An air horn. A man shouting that they wanted to talk, that they'd come to renegotiate, keeping us looking there, keeping us gathered there. Lyle had drilled everyone for a rush at the gate, and everyone went where they'd been drilled to go, toward the front. And I almost went too. I was halfway across the yard when the appraiser in me, the part that's always counting, counted the vehicles and came up short. 3 had come the first time. I could see 2 at the gate. Where was the box truck? I turned and ran for the far corner, for the siding, for the weak place I'd found on my third day and exploited on the 11th night, and then rebuilt with my own hands out of shame. And that's where they were. The box truck, lights off, backed up to the siding gate, and 2 of them already through it with bolt cutters. Because, of course, a competent group scouts the back of a property. Of course, they'd sent June to ask her careful questions and read the layout. Of course, they knew the front was theater. They were coming in the way I'd come in, past the far silos, on the route I'd once thought was only mine. It never had been. I'd just been arrogant enough to think a thing I could see was a thing others couldn't. I did the only thing I had. And it was a thing I'd set up without ever quite admitting I was setting it up for this. The generator wasn't running. It was the dead of night, everything dark. So I went for the shop, and I hit the starter the way Lyle had shown me. And I'd read off the plate a dozen times. And I gave it the moment it needs to catch and steady before you put a load on it. That awful long moment with two men and their bolt cutters at my back. And then it took and held. And I went to the panel I'd mapped and labeled in my own hand. And I threw the far corner breaker and lit the siding up like noon. The whole strip, the box truck, the two men with the cutters, everything blazing. And I killed every other circuit on the property so that the one bright place in the whole black landscape was them, out there, outside the wire, exactly where I'd once stood. And then I threw the grinder. The hammer mill in a grain shop is the loudest thing you have ever heard. I fed the far corner lights and the grinder off the generator and nothing else. Because I knew from my own labels those two loads it could carry together and a third would stall it. And I ran the grinder wide open with nothing feeding it, screaming and empty. And I ran it and I lit that corner, and I gave the infected in every ditch and field for a mile the one thing they respond to, which is noise and light in a place they can reach. And I pointed all of it at the men at the siding gate. I knew what I was doing. I want that on the record, because the story would go easier on me if I could say I panicked. If I could say I only meant to warn our people or scare theirs. That's not true. I stood at the breaker panel with my hand still on it, and I understood with total clarity that I was drawing the dead onto human beings. That some of the shapes already coming out of the dark toward the light and the sound were going to reach those two men before those men could get back through the gate. And I did not take my hand off the panel. 2 months earlier, I'd been a man who followed the woman he loved into a wreck to help a stranger. Now, I was a man who could stand at a switch and spend other people's lives to protect my own, and do the arithmetic while I did it, and feel, in place of horror, a kind of terrible calm. It worked the way I'd known it would. The infected came to the light and the noise, streaming out of the fields more than I'd guessed, and the two men at the gate got maybe halfway back to the box truck. One made it, one did not, and I heard it over the grinder, or I've told myself so many times that I heard it that now I can't separate the memory from the invention. The box truck's engine screamed, and it tore away from the siding and up the road. And at the front gate, June's people, hearing the mill go and seeing the far corner blaze and understanding all at once that their backplay had died on the wire, broke off and ran for their trucks too. But the dead were up now, all of them, everywhere, roused, and the county road was full of them. And June's two vehicles at the front had to punch through a road that was suddenly thick with the very thing they'd tried to use as a weapon. And that's how Lyle died. And I have never been able to make it a clean line from my hand to his. And I've stopped trying, because a thing can be your fault without being your design. When June's lead pickup clipped a body at the front and swerved, it clipped the main gate too. And the gate was already old and already strained. And it tore half off its hinges and left a gap. And in the chaos and the dark and the screaming of the mill I'd set loose, some of the infected, the fleeing trucks had scattered, found that gap. 2 of them came into the yard. And Tessa Hoyt, 6 years old, who in the confusion of everyone running the wrong directions had gotten separated from Sandra and was standing frozen by the scale house crying, was in their path. Lyle was closest. Lyle went. There was no time for it to be a decision. It wasn't a decision. It was just a man covering the ground to a child, because the child was there, and he was the one who could reach her. He got to her. He got her up, and he got her behind him, and he put himself between her and the 2 of them. and he killed one with the shotgun, and the second one took him as he turned. Took him on the forearm, one bite deep. And then Petey's wife was there with a length of pipe, and I was there. Finally, too late, always too late. And we put the second one down, and Tessa was alive and unmarked in Sandra's arms. And my brother stood in the ruined gate holding his forearm and looked at me across the yard. And we both knew. We got the gate braced. We got the lights killed and the grinders shut down and the generator off and the yard quiet. And the dead outside eventually drifted off the way they do, back into the fields, sated on noise that had stopped. June's people didn't come back. I found out later, or I pieced it together, that they'd lost at least 2 of their own that night on the road they'd tried to weaponize, and that it broke them as a group. We heard nothing from them again. My suspicion had been right. Everything I'd read off that box truck had been true. They were exactly what I thought they were, and they came exactly the way I feared. And being right about them cost the same as being wrong about Renata had cost. Being right did not give any of it back. Lyle sat on the step of the scale house with his arm wrapped, and he was calm in the way he'd been calm the whole time I'd known him. And everyone understood the situation, and everyone looked at me, because I was the one who'd taught them the rule by breaking it, and Lyle was the one who'd taught them the rule by keeping it. And now the rule pointed at Lyle. He didn't ask me to break it. That's the thing I hold on to, small and cold as it is. He didn't ask. He knew what I'd done for Renata. And he could have asked me to do it for him, to make an exception, to put him in a vehicle up near the shop and wait and hope. 11 days, and I'd have deserved to be asked. It would have been a fair thing to ask of the man who'd done it once for himself. He didn't. He looked at me and he said, "You know how this goes. Lyle, I chained the gate on Renata," he said. "First week. You've hated me for it every day since, and you were half right to. But I'm going to ask you to do the thing you couldn't do then. I'm going to ask you to keep the rule when it's me." He said it evenly, no drama in it. A man closing out an account. Trailer, same as her, outside the wire. 2 weeks. Except we both know it won't be 2 weeks. And I need you to not come open the door in the night. That's the whole thing I'm asking. Whatever else you are now, be that. I moved him to the trailer myself, out past the siding gate, on the strip, outside the fence, the same tin single wide on the same blocks, the most exposed point for a mile. The place I'd once argued was too dangerous for Renata to have to stay. I ran the cord out under the fence. I brought the water and the food. I stood my distance the way he'd stood his, and I checked on him morning and evening, in the light, the way he'd made us do it. And this time, when the fever came up, I didn't tell him it was the dust. I didn't tell him anything. I sat outside the door on the last night, on the ground, with my back against the trailer, and he sat inside on the bunk, and we didn't talk much. He asked about Dad's tools, whether I'd keep the shop running. He said the well pump seal was going and where the spare was. He said, "Take care of Tessa. She's the reason. Don't ever let her think she was the reason." Ordinary things. The last real thing he said to me, near the end of the night, through the thin wall, was, "You did the mill wrong, wanting to sell it. But I did you wrong too, telling myself I kept it for Dad. I kept it because I was scared of what I'd be without it. We were both hiding behind the same building, Craig, just from different sides." And then he was quiet, and toward morning he wasn't Lyle anymore. And I did not open the door, and I did what had to be done through it, and I have never told anyone the details, and I'm not going to now. We buried him behind the shop with Cody and at a distance with Renata. And Tessa put a drawing in the ground with him because Sandra told her that's what you do. And I dug the grave because digging graves had become the thing they let me do. And I did it right, square and deep, because it was the last honest work I would ever do for my brother. That was 3 months ago. The mill is still standing. There are 6 of us now, Beth and Tessa and the middle Hoyt boy, Sandra and Petey's son, and me. The corn's holding out longer with fewer mouths, which is an arithmetic I do without flinching now. The arithmetic where a death is also a resource that lasts longer. And I don't like the man who can think that thought without flinching. But I've stopped pretending I'm not him. We got through the worst of the winter. The well pump's seal held after I replaced it with a spare. Lyle told me about. We're careful about light, and careful about noise, and careful, above all, about the gate. And the person who's most careful about the gate is me, which nobody planned and nobody's ever remarked on out loud. I'm not the leader. I want to be clear about that, because there's a version of this where the hard man ends up in charge, and it's told like a triumph. And that's not what happened, and it's not what this is. Sandra runs the food. Beth runs the kids and half the sense of the place. When something needs deciding, we decide it together, mostly around the table in the scale house. And my voice carries more weight than it should. And it carries because I'm the one who reads the situations right more often than not. And because I'm the one willing to say the ugly number out loud. That's not the same as being trusted. Sandra trusts me the way you trust a good lock, not the way you trust a person. A car came to the outer gate 2 days ago. It came up the county road in the late afternoon, slow, the way you come when you're not sure you're welcome, and it stopped well back. And a man got out with his hands showing. And there was a woman in the passenger seat and a child in the back, a girl maybe 8. And the man called up that they'd been on the road 3 weeks, and they'd heard there was a working mill and they had a little to trade, and mostly they just needed somewhere for the girl to be still for a while. I went down to the gate alone. Sandra watched from the scale house. The chain was where it always is now, run through the links and the post, the padlock closed, the same chain Lyle closed against Renata in the first week, the same fence that had failed at the siding the night I brought her through. All of it mine to keep now, and I keep it. I looked at their car the way I look at everything. It was low on fuel, riding light, no cargo to speak of, which fit their story. The man's hands shook, which fit it too. The girl in the back had her face against the window, and she was looking at me. And I thought about Tessa frozen by the scale house. And I thought about the woman on the highway who Renata knelt down to help. And I felt both of those things, and I felt them from a great distance, the way you feel weather through glass. I didn't open the gate. I told him there was water in the culvert half a mile back that ran clean. And I told him the church in Kesterson had had people through it last month. I didn't know if it still did. And I told him the co-op silos 20 miles east had been picked over, but the town around them was quiet. I got a case of water and a sack of shelled corn from the shop, and I passed it through the links, under the chain, into his hands. And I told him I was sorry, and I meant it, and meaning it didn't move my hand toward the lock. The man looked at me for a long moment through the fence, the way I once looked at Lyle through the same wire. And I saw him understand that I wasn't going to change my mind. And I saw him decide, the way you do, that arguing with a chained gate is a waste of the daylight you've got left. He said, "There's a child," like it was the last card, and he already knew it wasn't a card at all. Not here, not with me. "I know," I said. "There's one in here too." He put the water in his car, and he turned it around, and he drove back the way he'd come, slow, into the long light. And the girl kept her face to the window until they were out of sight around the bend. And I stood at the gate with my hand on the chain until the sound of the engine was gone and the road was quiet, and it was just the mill and the fields and the coming dark. I don't know if I did right. There's a girl on the road tonight who was looking at me through her window. And maybe the culvert water's foul, and maybe the church is gone. And if that's what I did, then I'll carry it with the rest. And there's a lot of rest. But there's a girl in here too. And she's alive because her whole world learned the hard way what comes through a gate you open on, maybe. I checked the lock before I came in. I always check the lock. I stood there in the dark, and I ran my hand down the links and felt for the padlock and found it closed. And I thought about Lyle doing the same thing on this same fence in the first week while I sat in a trailer hating him for it. The chain was cold, and it held. I left it the way it was.